we're working on this, let me just let you know that the thing, like you see up here on the screen, is more or less the way a city can say it's sorry for something, or a state can say it's sorry for something that it did in the past. So maybe a monument is a way to make amends. We did something we regret years ago. Here's a monument to commemorate this event, and it's a sign that we'll do our best to make sure it doesn't happen again. And I've chosen 3, maybe 4 if we have time, monuments in Boston that I think do a really good job of saying we're sorry and pledging that it's not going to happen again. And if we can't do this automatically, I guess we can do it manually. But while we're working out, I'll just give you one very small example of that. Oh, we can just stay on this slide if that's going to work. Let's see. Oh, yeah, I think it's working now. Right. So let's just start here because we got our slides. That, of course, is Bill Russell, and there is President Obama giving Bill Russell the Presidential Medal of Freedom. During that ceremony, almost as an aside, President Obama said, wouldn't it be nice, and I think the day should come, when Boston has a statue of Bill Russell. And I'm not sure he really planned out that statement, but in fact, it got a lot of people thinking, and different groups around Boston began to raise money for a Bill Russell monument. And eventually, although it took some doing, we did get a Bill Russell monument that was just dedicated a few years ago by my fellow Somervillian. She's the one who sculpted it, Ann Hirsch. Most basketball monuments that you see, and there's a lot of them now outside NBA arenas, feature something like this. There's Michael Jordan. It's almost always a basketball player going up in dunking, or maybe it's a basketball player making a jump shot, but it's usually a basketball player scoring. They're almost all like that. But our monument to Bill Russell is very different because Ann Hirsch, the sculptor, actually went out to San Francisco to talk to him. And she learned right away that Bill Russell did not want a monument that just depicted him doing something on his own. He wanted a monument that would commemorate the values that he thought were important: commitment, resolve, community, teamwork. He was especially proud of the way he would mentor youth during his NBA career and afterwards, and he's still very much engaged with that later in life. And so this is the monument we got. It's very unique among basketball monuments because Bill Russell is actually passing the ball. He's engaged in teamwork here, and you'll notice those granite plinths all around. They all have inscribed on them the kind of values and virtues that he liked, especially teamwork and things like that. And I like those granite plinths because this monument is right by Government Center, and it echoes the architecture of City Hall in very historic ground. Because the reason I bring that up, the Bill Russell monument, is in a way that's an attempt at expiation, an attempt at making amends, an attempt to reclaim civic space from an event that happened several decades before the monument was dedicated, as well as another event I'll talk about. It was on that very spot, or really just a few feet away, that this famous photograph was taken in 1976. And that's a teenager attacking with an American flag the civil rights activist Ted Landsmark in the midst of the great busing controversy that afflicted Boston in the middle of the 1970s. So putting Bill Russell there, an advocate of charity and humanitarianism and teamwork, is a way to reclaim that civic space from an association that represents the very opposite of those values. And I think it succeeds wonderfully well, not just because it happened right about there when that act of intolerance occurred during the busing crisis, but also because Bill Russell and his monument are on the same spot as another moment of Boston intolerance that happened all the way back in 1835. And in fact, the date is October 23rd, 1835. An abolitionist named George Thompson from England was going to give a speech at a little place called Stacey Hall, which occupied the right-hand part of that picture that you see before you in 1835. He was a very notorious, well-known abolitionist, and ads appeared in the paper before his speech, just a couple of days before, that somebody, whoever put out the ad, would award $100 to anybody who could take hold of George Thompson and tar and feather him, so he would be unable to make that speech. Thompson knew about that ad. Everybody knew about that ad. Thompson decided discretion was the better part of valor and very sensibly stayed away from Stacey Hall. rather than give his speech before a crowd, small crowd, of Boston abolitionists. It's 1835. There weren't many abolitionists in 1835, but such as there were in Boston were gathered at Stacy Hall. Well, Thompson was not going to make a speech, but one man decided he would brave the crowd, he would take the risk, and that was William Lloyd Garrison, who walked down from his office just a few steps away from Stacy Hall in the scene of that picture to give a speech in front of these anti-slavery figures, especially the women of Boston, active in the abolitionist movement. And as he walked towards Stacy Hall that afternoon, he could see all around him a hostile crowd gathering, shouting catcalls at him, shouting insults at him, young toughs especially, but extremely well-dressed young toughs. These were not street ruffians. These were members of the Boston elite who had no use for abolitionism because they had all those business contacts with the South. They had wanted nothing to do with Garrison, but Garrison made his way through the crowd anyway into Stacy Hall, and he was all ready to give that speech as the crowd got bigger and louder outside. It looked as if the crowd might try to invade Stacy Hall and do something awful to the people gathered therein. And because of that, Mayor Theodore Lyman made his way through the crowd, made his way through the shouts, went into Stacy Hall, and he tried to convince the ladies of the Abolitionist Society to close down the meeting and just go home. And that gave rise to one of the great quotes of American abolitionism, one of the great quotes of the 1830s, I think, by a woman who deserves a statue of her own in Boston, Maria Weston Chapman, and this is what she said to Mayor Lyman: "If we are the last bulwark of freedom, we may as well die here as anywhere." She was in her grave. "We may as well die here as anywhere." Lyman tried to reason with her. She was adamant that they'd have the meeting, but eventually the crowd grew so hostile that in the interest of the safety of her brethren, her sister Ren, she decided to lead a group of abolitionists outside Stacy Hall. And they made sure that white women and black women would walk outside hand in hand, arm in arm, in front of the small hurling insults at them. Leaving, and she's going to have the meeting at her house just a couple blocks away, close to what is now West Street, off of Tremont Street. But as she was leaving, William Lloyd Garrison, his life was really in danger, and they were afraid if he walked out, the crowd would attack him and maybe do violence to him. So they convinced him to go upstairs. They convinced him to try to get out through an upper floor window, and he was able to get out and seek refuge in a nearby building, but that's where the crowd finally figured out where it was. And they caught him there. They let him out of that building, and they had a rope around his waist, and they were leading him down Washington Street at a time when Washington Street continued through what is now City Hall Plaza out to Congress Street. So they're leading him down Washington Street. This is what the scene looked like. Nobody knew what was going to happen to him. Luckily, before anything terrible could happen to him, as they're dragging him along with a rope around his waist, Mayor Lyman appeared again and was able to rescue him and actually confine him to the Leverett Street jail so that the crowd could not do further violence to William Lloyd Garrison. So his life was saved near the steps of the old State House that October day of 1835. And it's really one of the most shameful days in Boston's history because nobody called out the police to do anything about this. There wasn't much of a police force, but there were constables who might have helped. The mayor could have called out the militia, and Wendell Phillips, the great abolitionist, Wendell Phillips was looking around him while all these events were happening and wondering, why isn't the mayor calling out the militia? We got to do something about this. We got to save William Lloyd Garrison. But as Wendell Phillips was looking around, he noticed that many of the members of the militia were in the mob and taking part in the entire disgraceful event. So it was just by an eyelash that William Lloyd Garrison's life was preserved that day. And abolitionists never forgot this, although the forces of the mob were praised in some Boston papers. Abolitionists, of course, were never going to forget something like this. And then, ultimately, as abolitionists gained in popularity and power, and we finally get into the Civil War, all of a sudden William Lloyd Garrison was not the outlier that he was in 1835. He was now becoming a hero to more and more people because of his steadfast allegiance to the cause all through those difficult years. And when he died in 1879, of course, he had the satisfaction of knowing that the 13th Amendment had finally been ratified 14 years before. So the question was, what would we do now that the great William Lloyd Garrison was dead? Year is 1879, and Wendell Phillips decided to gather a committee to decide on an appropriate memorial. What they originally decided to do would not have been a bad idea. They wanted to raise money, not for a monument, but rather to contribute funds for African-American education down in Virginia at the Hampton Institute. A fine idea. They began to raise money. Garrison would have loved that, but regrettably, they didn't raise as much as they needed to make a difference down at the Hampton Institute. And so finally, after they had $15,000 in the bank, they decided that's enough for a monument. Let's have a statue. And the city that had dragged Garrison down the street in 1835 would now put a statue of Garrison up in finally 1886 on Commonwealth Avenue, right by Clarendon, which is where you can see it to this day. And this is the man who would do the monument. And I think it's really, really lucky that they settled on him. So the man who gave us the William Lloyd Garrison statue on Comm Ave is Olin Warner. And there you see in his studio, Olin Warner, growing up in Connecticut, had always wanted to be a sculptor. But by the time he had made that determination, he knew he had to go to Paris to study. The age of Rome and Florence as being the places all sculptors went to learn their jobs, those days were fading. He wanted to go to Paris to learn the latest principles in naturalistic figurative art. And that's where Olin Warner wanted to go. But his family had very little money. So he went to work in a telegraph office, learned to be an expert telegrapher, did well at that, earned enough money, crossed while he was still in his 20s, the Atlantic, to learn sculpture in Paris. And he was there in 1870 when the Prussian army marched to the suburbs in the midst of the Franco-Prussian War. He could have left. He could have left Paris. He could have found safety. But by now, Olin Warner had fallen in love with the French people. He loved them. He hated Napoleon III, was really happy when he was deposed, and he wanted to be with the Parisians in their hour of peril, with the German army surrounding the city in the Great Siege of 1807. And there, during the siege, as the weather became colder and the winter set in, Olin Warner had no firewood. He had to walk around Paris to get warm in the depths of the winter, there being no way to do so in his apartment. Along with the rest of the people of Paris, he began to be close to starvation. He was living on poor, rotten bread. He was living eventually on rats by January of 1871. But he stayed with the people of Paris. And not only that, but Olin Warner of Connecticut, who you see before you, joined a militia to help defend Paris. They were called Les Amis de la France. The Friends of France. That's right, the Friends of France. And he joined that militia, served very well, and then finally it's January of 1871. And then a few months later, Olin Warner was still in the capital, still learning his craft, when the famous Parisian Commune began, and all of a sudden France was wrapped up in a horrible civil war in the streets of Paris. And Olin Warner could see in front of him people killed. He could see bodies stacked up like cordwood in the streets in front of him. He saw atrocities. He knew a girl who was murdered by the authorities in Paris because she was carrying around kerosene, and they thought it might be a bomb. He knew all this. He saw all this. And in the spring of 1871, after all this was over, after Bloody Week was done, which was May of 1871, he finally decided to come back to the United States. And he told his family, if I'm ever in a place where there's about to be a siege, and I say I'm going to stay, you can come get me. You can come get me. You actually wrote that in a letter home. I never want to see anything like that again. But he came home with an enduring respect for people who fought for freedom and for people who fought for their principles. He defended the communards, those who were assaulting the government in 1871. He defended them in the American press. He thought very highly of them. He considered them freedom fighters until the day he died. And so he was delighted when he got the William Lloyd Garrison Commission because he really looked up to Garrison. Garrison was like the kind of people who fought for their principles and their values in 1870 and 1871. So this is the monument that Olin Warner gave us of William Lloyd Garrison. And I like it very much because it's a very natural, relaxed pose that Garrison has. And it's something that depicts the great abolitionist as if he is taking a pause in his work, because right behind him is a book, as you see. He's probably been referring to that in one of his lectures or editorials. And you can't really see it in the picture, but there's an ink pot back here, and there's a quill pen that he could dip in and use it to write when the mood struck him. But the best thing about this monument is not just the kind of natural pose. There's nothing classical, neoclassical about this. It's a good, natural human pose. The principles that Warner had learned in Paris. But to me, the best thing about it is the expression on Garrison's face. And if you look at the monument closely and you see it with any kind of accuracy, it's the face of a man who is resting after a life of virtuous struggle. It's somebody who's fought the good fight and has the great good fortune to look back on his life as something consecrated to something above and beyond and greater than himself. That is the cause of human freedom. This is somebody who knew he did the right thing when it was very difficult to do it. Many, many years after the events of 1835, what we have here is a testament to the way you can look back on your life if you devote it to the good. And it's a lesson for all of us. It's an enduring lesson, and it's captured in bronze. And not only that, but if you look at it closely, the way one reviewer looked at it, it almost seems as if he's not just resting. He looks like he wants to write another editorial. He wants to actually get back in the fight if, in fact, a cause comes up again that he can devote his energies to. One reviewer said, this Garrison looks like, despite the fact that he's in old age here, he's ready to leap to his feet, to defend, to attack, to suffer. And he's only sitting in a chair until he finds a suitable reason to do so. And I think he still strikes me that way today, and also a lot of other people. It's a tribute to the memory of one who was, quote, in the words of one reviewer, bravely and unselfishly devoted to the defense of justice and humanity, despite almost insurmountable obstacles, who triumphed without sacrificing his principles. So it's one of the most inspiring monuments in Boston, and it repays a really close look. And it's probably also one of the better monuments in Boston, for that matter. And there is William Lloyd Garrison. And we are very lucky to have this statue because Olin Warner, as I said, completed it in 1886. The original cast was botched at the foundry, lost completely, to Warner's despair, but he went back to work. They had another cast made. And it was dedicated in 1886. There were only 50 people at the dedication. Only friends and family of Garrison happened to be there, but it was dedicated then. And Olin Warner by then was in his 40s. He depended upon this statue to establish his reputation. This would make him well known. And in fact, he began to do better after this statue. He was based in New York, began to get more work after this, but he had a precious short time to enjoy it. And that's why I say we're lucky to have this. In 1892, 6 years after this was dedicated, his beloved daughter, Eleanor, whom he thought the universe of, all of a sudden died. And he would blame himself for the next 4 years. There must have been something we could do. He and his wife were never quite the same again. And in 1896, during the famous heat wave of 1896, the same heat wave that some historians claim to be the reason for William McKinley's victory in 1896, that famous heat wave was so bad that Olin Warner told his wife and remaining child, you go off into the country, you seek relief from this, I'll stay here in New York. And during the heat wave, he got on his horse to take a ride in Central Park. And while he was near Central Park West, a passing cab hit him. He fell from the horse and he died in the hospital. He was, I think, only 51 years old when he died. So we'll never know the vast variety and diversity and uniqueness of work that we were deprived of because he died at that point. But we do have this statue, and we do have this. The famous bronze doors at the Library of Congress in Washington, those are Olin Warner's. So next time you go to Washington, pay tribute to his designs at the Library of Congress. Here's an example of that. So that's the William Lloyd Garrison statue, and that's one example to me of a city making amends. During the dedication ceremony, they talked about this. We let him be dragged through the streets in 1835. We denied freedom of speech in 1835. We won't do that again. And here's the sign. Here's William Lloyd Garrison. We think about him highly enough to have him captured in bronze for all time on Commonwealth Avenue. But there's another good example of that. And there she is, Mary Dyer. And Mary Dyer is a name you'll all probably recognize. She was the Quaker who was hanged in 1660 by the administration of Governor Endicott, because despite a law barring Quakers on pain of death, she had insisted on going to Boston and speaking out for her brethren, captured Quakers who were languishing in jail. So she was hanged, and that was in 1660, and the question was, what could we do about that? Could we find a way to memorialize Mary Dyer? And it may not surprise you that the question did not arise for decades and decades and decades, centuries in fact, until finally, in the 1940s, a guy named Zeno Ellis, a banker up in Vermont, direct descendant of Mary Dyer, decided it's high time we had a statue in Boston. So Ellis left a will, and in the will was $12,000 left to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts on the condition they erect a monument to Mary Dyer, preferably somewhere on the State House lawn. But this was $12,000. It's free money. It goes to the legislature. The State House thought it was a great idea. State Senate said, why not? Let's have a statue of Mary Dyer. The complication was they probably didn't know who she was. And when they found out who she was, a Quaker was actually executed by the government of Massachusetts. The Massachusetts Senate thought maybe it's not such a good idea. And they tried to backtrack on this, but the State House still thought it was an okay idea. There was all sorts of controversy for years about whether this would actually happen, till finally the state decided, we're going to do it. We're going to have a monument to Mary Dyer. They decided a $12,000 appropriation would stand, and all the State House Art Commission now had to do, that is the State Art Commission, was decide on a sculpture. So who would it be? And there were several different, very well-known sculptors who entered a competition to give us a statue of the martyred Quaker Mary Dyer on the State House lawn. And one of them was Paul Manship, the great Paul Manship, who gave us the Prometheus Monument outside of Rockefeller Center. But the Art Commission thought that wasn't quite it. That doesn't quite send the right message. We don't have the design handy, but that's Manship's work. And another guy who submitted a design, one of the finest figurative sculptors of the mid-20th century, Walker Hancock. You can see his work at the MFA. He's the one who gave us the memorable statue of the angel holding a fallen warrior at the 30th Street station in Philadelphia. You can't go to that station without seeing this. He would have been a pretty good choice, but there's something about it not quite right. So the Art Commission was having a terrible time. Who would it be? Who are we going to give the commission to? And then into the picture stepped another relative of Mary Dyer. She's got like 100,000 of them. And this relative was in Woburn, a guy named Evans. And Evans said, I'm a relative of Mary Dyer, and he thought, I need a statue. We got to get a statue put up, because he wanted to make a movie about Mary Dyer. And what better way to publicize the movie but have a statue going up at about the same time? So he wanted this done right away in the 50s, and he had a sculptor in mind, and it was the same guy who gave us the Gloucester Fisherman's Monument in Gloucester, Leonard Krask. And Leonard Krask had the inside track, because Evans actually went to see the governor about this, Governor Bradford. We need Krask to do a statue. So the Art Commission looked at Krask's design, and the design depicted a woman, presumably Mary Dyer, with her fingers up in the air like this, about to be hanged. A very, very dramatic design. And that was a perfectly natural choice for a design for somebody about to be hanged. Mary Dyer was hanged, after all. That's what Frederick McMonnies gave us with Nathan Hale. We all know he's about to be hanged, and this is the way he looked when he was about to be hanged. So why not do that with Mary Dyer? And he points out to heaven as a source of her blessings. And they were about to do it. But here is where the benefits of an art commission come in. This is the State Art Commission now, not Boston, because it's going on the State House lawn. And a member of the State Art Commission was a guy named Joseph Coletti. And he happened to talk to a friend who said, I have just the person, the only person who can do justice to Mary Dyer. And Coletti looked at that person's work and decided this is the one, nobody else. Has anybody ever heard of Joseph Coletti? Joseph Coletti, you may not have heard of him, but every single one of you has seen his work. And I'll show you his work. That's General Logan at Logan Airport. So you've all gone by General Logan. And you can see General Logan for about 3.5 seconds, and then you go by to your terminal. But that's the work of Joseph Coletti. He used to be out there right by Boston Harbor. You had a nice windswept view of the Seagull, but they moved him over here unfortunately, by the streets. And he doesn't really do him justice. But Joseph Coletti was a fine sculptor, and he looked at a design submitted by a woman who you would never think would ever do any kind of a figurative monument anywhere. And she was a woman out in Illinois, and her name was Sylvia Shaw Judson. Sylvia Shaw Judson of Lake Forest, Illinois, was accustomed to garden monuments. So she would give us things like this. That's the little gardener. Some of you may have seen that. That's in the White House garden because Jackie Kennedy liked it and bought it. So you can see that at the White House. It's pretty cool. But Sylvia Shaw Judson's best known work, in fact, one of the best known sculptures in the world, is actually a cemetery sculpture. And you've all seen it. And there she is. From Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. The family that commissioned that calls her Little Wendy, but nobody calls her Little Wendy. What do they call her? Bird Girl. Yeah, so that's Bird Girl. And she was such a popular site in the cemetery, St. Bonaventure, I think, at Savannah, that they eventually had to take it out of the cemetery and put it in the Telfair Museum of Art. And I just talked about the terrible anti-abolitionist riot in Boston. If you ever want to see another riot, go to Savannah and tell people that that's not on display, and there'll be a riot, because that's when everybody goes to the Telfair Museum to see that. So she did that. It didn't become famous until a photographer, after Sylvia Shaw Judson died, needed something for the book cover at Midnight Garden and Evil. His name was Lee. And he went to the cemetery. He's looking for something gothic, something strange, and he thought that would be perfect. So that's on the cover of the book. And that's how Sylvia Shaw Judson, after she died, achieved international fame. But all that hadn't happened yet. It's only the 1950s. Joseph Clay looked at her work and had the insight, the artistic insight to know that she was the perfect person for a sculpture of Mary Dyer. And the reason was that Sylvia Shaw Judson, whose picture I showed you just a while ago, was herself a Quaker. And Sylvia Shaw Judson knew what it was like to sit silently and try to listen for God's word. Try to hear God's still voice talking. She knew the value of stillness. She knew the value of meditation. And she could see something of the strength that would have led Mary Dyer to take her life into her hands, to stand up against Boston authority back in 1660. So she got to work on her sculpture, and this is what it's eventually going to remind us of course. There's Mary Dyer walking to her doom, about to be hanged. Where? Nobody really knows where she was hanged. Generations of duck boat tour guides have always said Boston Common. It might have been on Boston Common. I think it wasn't. I think it was down Washington Street on what was then the Neck, where she was probably hanged. There's a debate about that, but she surely was hanged. And this is why it's so special that we have a monument to her. Mary Dyer was a friend of Anne Hutchinson. She was banished at the same time Anne Hutchinson was banished, but not before she had given birth. And because John Winthrop and the other Puritan fathers wanted to do everything possible to blacken the reputation of the friends of Anne Hutchinson, what they did after Mary Dyer left was they found the stillborn child of Mary Dyer that had been buried. They dug the child up. The child was only 5 months old in the womb when the stillbirth happened. The poor child was a victim of what we call anencephaly. There was no developed brain in the skull. When they dug up the child, however, this is what John Winthrop wrote. There were ears on the shoulders. This was a hideous creature. There were claws on the feet. This was a mixture of bird, beast, fish, a foul thing with scales. He made up all sorts of slanderous accusations about poor Mary Dyer's stillborn child, as if to say God had struck down this child because she betrayed our predestinationist Puritan theology that had some room, at least, for good public behavior. Scads of theological treatises have written about the controversy, but it all came down to people in power blackening the reputation of somebody who disagreed with them. And that's why Dyer was down in Rhode Island with Anne Hutchinson. She and her family founded Newport, Rhode Island. So think of them the next time you're down there. And then, crucially, after several years in Newport, Mary Dyer went to England. And there she became influenced by the Quakers. And the Quakers were a sect that were practicing what they called the Lamb's War. The Lamb's War against authority. against earthly authority that would quell what our own inner voices tell us to be the proper conduct. God speaking directly to us. She was moved by the Quakers and their suffering. She was moved by the sight of Quakers being whipped through towns because they insisted on practicing their faith, despite the fact that it was discouraged under Cromwell's Commonwealth government. And she became a Quaker herself. And when she came back to New England, Quakers were barred from Boston on pain of death. She went to Boston anyway. They sent her back. She went to Boston a second time. They escorted her out. She wanted to help her imprisoned brethren. She wanted to show them her support. She went to Boston a third time. This time they decided to hang her. They took her out. They took her up to the gallows. Two of her friends were hanged. They put a rope around her neck. They were about to tighten the rope. And then at the last minute, Endicott said, "You are reprieved. You can leave." She left. She came back a fourth time. And this time, they really meant it. And the reason her monument is so moving is it reminds us, perhaps, of the last few days before her death, or her decision to go back to Boston. And here she is. There's nothing grandiose about it. There's nothing inherently or vividly dramatic about it. It's one woman with conviction listening to the voice of God within her to tell her what to do. Go back to Boston, court the hostility of those in power. This is what she told the authorities in Boston. "I came out of obedience to God, desiring you to repeal your unrighteous laws of banishment. And that same is my work now." They took her to the gallows. She wasn't going to be saved now. And most significantly, in the thing everybody should remember, and the reason this is one of the best public monuments in Boston, is it should remind us of this. This is what she said, almost her last words. "I came to keep blood guiltiness from you. Therefore, my blood will be required of your hands who willfully do it." It's 1660. 200 years before Henry David Thoreau, Mary Dyer had a theory of civil disobedience. And what she was saying is, this law is so bad, it's implicating the entire community of Boston in its evil. You will never know that, you'll never recognize it unless I come among you and die. Only my death will show you how bad you're erring, how bad this law is, that banishes us for a conscience. It'll take my death. And in doing this, she anticipates the civil rights movement, and she anticipates Martin Luther King going to Mississippi during the Freedom Summer, even though he had every reason to think that might be the end of him. The end that would finally come 4 years later. And Mary Dyer reminds us of that kind of sacrifice by which the rest of us have some chance to live in a decent commonwealth. And here she is, listening to the voice of God that sent her to her death. Only death, Mary Dyer thought, could save Boston from its sinful law. And in fact, she was the last to die. Boston would repeal that law under the urgings of Charles II a little bit later, and there would be no more Quakers hanged in Boston after her. She was the last. Her sacrifice wasn't in vain. So talk about a moment of expiation, making amends. Mary Dyer on the State House lawn.
Dan?
Yes?
Excuse me, can you read what it says on the bottom line?
Oh, I'm glad you pointed that out because Rachel Shaw Judson, who was, of course, the sculptor, Sylvia Shaw Judson, she got to pick the inscription. She got to pick what was going to go on the base. And they're the words of Mary Dyer. My life, witness for religious freedom, but she said, "My life not availeth me in comparison to the liberty of the truth." My life not availeth me in comparison to the liberty of the truth. So William Lloyd Garrison could have said that. My life not availeth me next to the liberty of the truth. And for that she died. Not everybody liked it. A guy named, some of you may remember this guy. He was a state comptroller for forever. A guy named Joseph Alex down in the State House. He had to look out the window at her. He didn't like it. He didn't like being reminded that maybe people in power aren't always great. So he wanted her replaced with General Casimir Pulaski. But luckily, the State House said, no, we kind of like Mary Dyer, and so that's where she is. So that's our second example of expiation. The state saying it's sorry in a way for the benefit of all of us. And those who know the story of Mary Dyer can't walk by this without being lifted up at the thought that we're people like this willing to die for conscience and for freedom, for truth, and for liberty. And here's another example, maybe not quite the same vein of example, but something that I think fits the bill. That is Thomas Cass. Now, Thomas Cass was an Irish immigrant. He came at a very young age to Boston during the 1840s, worked very hard as a youth, went to school for a while, learned what he needed to learn, then went into business, became the owner of a tugboat in Boston Harbor, and as commerce was exploding in the middle of the 19th century, you could do worse than own a tugboat, taking things into Boston Harbor. Thomas Cass began to prosper, so much so that when he was in his 30s, he decided to do what you could do if you were a well-known member of the Boston community, if people were beginning to look up to you. There he was living close to the North End, among the Irish of Boston, and what he decided to do was form a militia company that would help defend the state in time of need. And he would be the colonel of this militia company that he would raise at his own expense. And he called it the Columbian Artillery. And they began to parade around. They had nice festivals and picnics out in Natick. They had a nice time for themselves, but they could also be called into service whenever the state needed something done that was important in terms of security, until the Know-Nothings won control of Massachusetts, which they did in 1855. And Governor Gardner of the Know-Nothings decided that we can't have armed Irish. We can't have Catholics with guns, much less artillery. And so he ordained that if you're somebody not born in the United States, you can't lead an artillery company or any other kind of militia company. And that meant Thomas Cass, who was born in Ireland, could no longer be the colonel of the Columbian Artillery. And he told that to his men, and his men said, fine, we're all going to resign. So no more Columbian Artillery because of this antagonism towards the Catholic Irish. So that was 1855. And then 6 years later, we get Fort Sumter, actually almost this December 1860. And at that point, all of a sudden, Massachusetts needed Irish soldiers. They got to send themselves, they got to fight the Confederacy. So all of a sudden it was fine for Irishmen to bear rifles and artillery, and the call went out for Irish enlistees. And Thomas Cass, who you see here, let bygones be bygones, and he said, I will form a regiment. And he got his old Columbian Artillery friends together, they got a bunch of other new recruits, and they formed the 9th Massachusetts Volunteers, always called the Irish 9th, because it was almost entirely North End Irish from Boston. They got together, they formed the regiment, they paraded in front of Governor Andrew in 1862 on the way to Virginia. By the way, they were trained out in Deer Island. Must have been desolate in the winter of 1861 getting trained out there. But they were finally ready to go. They went down to Virginia. They joined McClellan's army, April of 1862. They fought in front of Richmond in the 7 days battle in late May of 1862. I should say late June 1862. They fought every step of the way. Gaines Mill, Seven Pines. And finally, on the morning of July 1st, 1862, we meet Thomas Cass staring down what everybody called a hill. We would call it just a mere rise in the ground. Right in front of Harrison Landing, Virginia, as General Magruder and his portion of the Army of Northern Virginia were about to make a last assault on McClellan's lines with the purpose of driving the Army of the Potomac into James River. So staring right down at those Confederate rifles was the Irish 9th in Thomas Cass. And they began to come out of the woods. Artillery shells began to fall. Thomas Cass began directing fire to hold the line at Melbourne Hill, and along with his fellow regiments to save McClellan's army. And then, all of a sudden, at the height of the action, a bullet entered his throat. Another one took away part of his jaw. He fell down incapacitated. The Irish 9th helped to hold the line, but Thomas Cass would barely know it. He was taken away. He lingered 11 days in agony and died in Boston, almost 2 weeks after his heroics at the Battle of Melbourne Hill. in the Boston Irish newspaper, the Boston Pilot, the Catholic Irish newspaper, bordered in black, everybody printed glowing obituaries of a man who was excoriated as an Irish Catholic back only a few years before, in 1855. Then the war ended, and the Irish Knight came home. This, by the way, is their regimental flag of the Irish Knight, presented to the 9th Regiment Massachusetts Volunteers. United we stand, divided we fall. Duty to God in our country. And I think I can find the actual inscription that the flag has, because you can't see it on the map. But let's see, here it is. It's coming up. As aliens and strangers, this is the Irish Knight, North End Irish. As aliens and strangers, thou didst us befriend. As sons and true patriots, we thee defend. The Irish Knight addressing its new country, the United States. So at the end of the war, the veterans of the Irish Knight went back to their jobs like everybody else did. And then the years went by, and the call began to go up for a monument to Thomas Cass. And by the 1880s, the veterans of the 9th Regiment were raising money. Other Civil War veterans joined them, and they got permission from the city council. The problem was, this was the day before, or the days before, the Boston Art Commission. And the person they hired to do a Thomas Cass monument was somebody experienced with cemetery carvings. And he never done a public monument. In fact, at first he thought he was doing a cemetery monument. And the result was something small and silly and laughable. And it was so bad that when they unveiled it in 1888, there was an audible gasp of horror in the crowd. Everybody hated it. Nobody liked it. It was, aside from Cogswell's Fountain, which I showed you recently, perhaps the single worst piece of public art ever foisted upon the people of Boston. The Globe said that it actively disfigured the public art. The Evening Transcript said it afflicted the eyes like a hideous ghost. Respectful young sculptors, Daniel Chester French, Olin Warner was still alive. And yet they chose this man to do it. He was so embarrassed, but it wasn't his fault. He never thought this was what his commission was. And for years, you walked down the public garden and you'd be having a good day, and you look to your right, and there was Thomas Cass, and the afternoon would be ruined. And it was so bad that the veterans of the Irish Knights decided, we got to do something about this. The Boston Art Commission, which happened mostly because of Cogswell's Fountain, also happened because of this Thomas Cass hideousness. And they offered their help. Let's choose another sculptor. Let's find somebody to do a better statue for you. So they took out the Thomas Cass monument. And this is one of the rare instances where they replaced something really bad with something really good. And what they eventually got was a different Thomas Cass statue. And there it is. This is Thomas Cass, still in the public garden to this day. The great colonel of the Irish Knight, martyr of Melbourne Hill. And it's done by a sculptor named Richard Brooks, who also studied in Paris. And I like it because the pose is, it's not really stiff or formal. It's the pose of an officer looking out across a swale, wondering what the Assembly Confederate infantry might be up to, ready to spring into action if need be. His boot actually goes a little bit past the pedestal, as if he's about to spring up, walk, and start to give orders. The pose, according to Cass's family, was something that he often assumed himself. The boots are actually Cass's boots. Richard Brooks had the boots in front of him when he sculpted this memorial. And it very early on became one of the most highly regarded monuments in the public garden because it actually depicts a military person the way a military person would look, faced with a difficult, confusing situation, wondering what to do next. And that's why it succeeds. And I think it deserves participation in our theme, a monument of making amends, a monument of expiation. We're sorry we hanged Mary Dyer. We're sorry we dragged Garrett through the streets. And we're sorry, back in 1855, that we didn't actually conceive of the idea of an immigrant being just as willing to defend the country as anybody else. And for me, the enduring value and significance of this monument is it should remind us of that. That however much we might fear people from other countries and other climes and other parts of the world, nevertheless, their bravery, their creativity, their insistence on doing their best for us ought to be remembered and ought to be celebrated, rather than condemn. So this is a monument to me of if you look at it the right way, the contributions that immigrants have made despite all the hostility that they sometimes run into, then as now. And for that reason, it's enduringly important and valuable, the Thomas Cass Monument on the public garden. And that brings me to our last example, and I won't take up too much more time because I've spent 45 minutes already, but I did want everybody to know, because not everybody knows this person, the other person who deserves a monument that doesn't have one, and that's him, the great William Cooper Nell. Born in the 18 teens, I think 1811, if I remember, in Boston. William Cooper Nell was very precocious, showed a lot of intelligence almost right away. Anybody here go to the Boston Latin School? Well, in the old days, and I think there's still something like this today, the top students in Boston get the Franklin Medal because it's based upon Franklin's will. Franklin left some money for students in Boston, the best students, to get this medal, the famous Franklin Medal. And William Cooper Nell went to the all African American school at the African Meeting House on Beacon Hill, the old Smith School. And he was at the top of his class. He qualified for the Franklin Medal, but they wouldn't give it to him because he was 14 and black. Nobody wanted to sit next to him at the Franklin Medal ceremony at Faneuil Hall. And so because it was going to be segregated, he didn't get the medal. They did let him go in to wait tables, but they wouldn't let him sit with everybody else for the Franklin Medal. And he never forgot that. He never forgot that humiliation. And he decided to devote himself when he could to the abolitionist cause. When he was in his teens, he studied law. He could have been a lawyer. He read law, mastered a good bit of it, could have sat for the bar exam, which was oral back then. But he didn't want to be a lawyer, because to be a lawyer, he'd have to take an oath to defend the Constitution. And the Constitution had the fugitive slave clause in it. And so he wouldn't take the oath to defend the Constitution, so he never became a lawyer in Massachusetts. Instead, he decided to devote himself to abolition. He listened to a talk William Lloyd Garrison gave at the Boston Athenaeum in 1840, I think, and he never forgot it. He became friends with Garrison. One day, Garrison and Nell my wife and I did this yesterday, rode the train from Salem to Boston. And just past Salem, towards Lynn, the conductor approached them and said, you have to go sit in what they call the Negro pew. But you can't sit with a white man, you gotta go sit in that pew over there. And Nell was about to get up. Garrison said, wait a minute, and got up with Nell, and they both went and sat on the Negro pew. And Nell never forgot that act of generosity and became a follower of William Lloyd Garrison for the rest of his life. The reason he's so important was not just because he wrote articles for the Liberator, helped out Garrison any way he could during his life in Boston, but also because he did something that was brand new, something he invented. And I wanted to mention that because this is Black History Month. It occurred to Nell that one reason that people were so fearful and so dismissive of the abolitionist cause was that for many people, a black person held in slavery didn't really deserve their freedom, and a black person in the North didn't really deserve equality, because after all, they had never fought for freedom. They had never fought for liberty. And Nell did not think that was true. And he went to the Boston Athenaeum, and he went to whatever archive he could find. And he found all the records he could of black people who fought in the Revolution. And he wrote a book about that, 400 pages, called The Colored Patriots of the Revolution. Every single record he could find, hundreds and hundreds of people, he wrote about black people who fought in the Revolution and later in the War of 1812. And he published that book, the very first work of Black history and our tradition. William Cooper Nell's History of Black Patriots in the Revolution. And it's not only that, it's the first great example of a work of history by a progressive historian who wants to challenge the stereotypes of today by digging up the truth of yesterday. So the People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, this is the forerunner of that tradition. Let's rescue those old stories. Let's see what actually happened back then. And we owe all that to William Cooper Nell. who gave us those volumes back when he was in his 30s, before the Civil War. The abolitionist cause, however, remained ultimately his great driver, the thing that influenced his life more than anything else. And when the war began, he devoted himself to aiding the war effort. He actually became, because he knew Lincoln, the very first full-time black federal employee. He was named by Lincoln when he was in his 40s to the U.S. Post Office. Very first full-time black employee in what eventually became the U.S. Civil Service. But the thing that commends him to us right now is that in the 1850s, in fact, in 1851, while he was engaged in the abolition effort, he made a big decision. And he said to himself this: Daniel Webster gets a statue. Daniel Webster supported the Fugitive Slave Act, and he's got a statue in front of the State House. Why can't Crispus Attucks have a statue? Crispus Attucks, a mixture of black and Indian ancestry, was the first to die, according to Nell, in the Revolutionary cause. He died at the Boston Massacre, the first to be struck down by British muskets. Why doesn't he get a statue? He asked himself that question. He researched Crispus Attucks. He began to raise money for a Crispus Attucks monument. He got other people to join him. And among those who joined him was the great Lewis Hayden, who would eventually, during the war, raise money to give us the 54th and 55th Massachusetts Infantry, all black regiments that made such a reputation for themselves. Lewis Hayden joined the effort. He would eventually be the very first black legislator in Massachusetts. And the two of them talked to everybody they knew. They had balls, they had parties, they had fundraisers. They began to raise some money. But official Massachusetts wanted nothing to do with a Crispus Attucks monument. And the reason they wanted nothing to do with a Crispus Attucks monument of any sort was the general idea, the general supposition, was that Crispus Attucks was a ruffian, a street vagrant, a gang member, somebody engaged in lawless violence. We don't want to memorialize Crispus Attucks. This, after all, was the late 19th century. This was the time of Haymarket, the Paris Commune. This was a time of disorder among working class people. You don't want to put a monument to Crispus Attucks up. And William Cooper Nell died in 1874 with the satisfaction only of knowing there was money in the bank, but no permission for a Crispus Attucks monument anywhere. Lewis Hayden took up the fight, even though by now he was in his 70s and 80s. And they finally got reinforcements when Boston politics took a 180-degree turn. And the Irish of Boston began to find that they might win mayoral elections if only they had black support. And the Irish community and the black community, at least for a while, began to cooperate within the Democratic Party in Boston. And in the 1880s, they elected an Irish mayor, Hugh O'Brien. And now Boston began to petition for a Crispus Attucks monument, because that's one of the things Lewis Hayden and the African-American community wanted. Only they're not going to call it a Crispus Attucks monument now. They're going to call it the Boston Massacre Monument, because others who died on March 5th, 1770 were Irish, like Patrick Carr. And so we're going to make some compromises. Maybe it's not going to be the Crispus Attucks Monument, but it will be the Boston Massacre Monument, and it'll mention Crispus Attucks. And Lewis Hayden, a legislator himself, knew about compromises. That was fine with him. In the last year of his life, he had the satisfaction of watching Boston dedicate the Boston Massacre Monument on the Common. And this is what it looks like. And I think more people should pay attention to this than usually do. It's March 5th, 1770. There's the monument by Adolf Krauss, a sculptor named Adolf Krauss, who did this. Notice that we have a figure of liberty with the Phrygian cap on the head, for centuries the sign of a freed slave, America freeing herself from slavery. So here we have Liberty holding a broken chain in her right hand, very expressive of what the revolution was about, and a banner in her left. But the best part of it, to me, is the right foot. If you look at the foot here, you can't see it in the screen, but she is crushing the 11th century crown of Edward the Confessor, worn by English kings for over 1,000 years. And here she is crushing liberty, America, crushing the monarchy of King George. But the very, very best part of it is this eagle. So Krauss's eagle is alighting on the platform that Liberty stands on, as if to say, here's where the revolution starts. Here's where liberty begins. The eagle alights by liberty, the Boston Massacre of 1770, and who was the first to die but Crispus Attucks. And for many years, the Black community of Boston called this the Crispus Attucks Monument, and they had gatherings here because they felt it was especially theirs, in the heritage of William Cooper Nell in Lewis Hayden. And that eventually fell away over time. Most people think of it as a massacre monument today, but there's a movement as of 2024 to erect a brand new freestanding Crispus Attucks Monument somewhere in Boston that will just be the Attucks Monument, and this can still be the Boston Massacre Monument. Now, what some people don't like about it is what Adolf Krauss didn't really like about it. A lot of people think that pillar is a little bit too high. It reminds people of a crayon, unfortunately. But it actually was actually based upon something that a lot of sculptors knew about at the time. These are pillars in Ireland that are sometimes in that shape that you see around Ireland. A place called Glendalough has a pillar like that. And that's what Krauss based the design on. So he wasn't thinking about crayons, he was thinking about Irish pillars. And it stands there to this day. My favorite part of the story is that it really did take a long time. It took over 30 years to get this monument done. But there was a lot of opposition to it. Guess who didn't want this monument there? The elite of Boston. The guardians of Boston's past. Those who felt the history of Boston was their preserve. They owned it. They got to interpret it. I'm speaking of none other than a beloved organization that I'm a member of today, which is way better than it used to be. The Massachusetts Historical Society. The Massachusetts Historical Society, which, as I might have mentioned, I'm a member of, and I really like it. So if they're watching, I love all of you. In the 19th century, back in the 1880s, the Mass Historical Society blinched at the idea of a Boston Massacre Monument because, again, these were the upper crust of Bostonians. And what they didn't want was something that seemed to glorify working class riot. And they thought the Boston Massacre was a riot. So I want to read you some quotes from Mass Historical Society members who tried to stop this. They tried to stop it in their tracks. Crispus Attucks, according to John D. Washburn, lawyer, benefactor of the Mass Historical Society, John D. Washburn said, these were rioters who died as fools died. Quoting the Old Testament, there's something about Abner in the Old Testament. Dr. Andrew Peabody of Harvard, Dr. Andrew Peabody of Harvard went so far as to refer to the dead of the massacre as so-called victims. While Dr. Charles Dean of the Mass Historical Society deplored the idea of placing a martyr's crown upon a vulgar ruffian like Crispus Attucks. They actually put a deputation together. They went to see Oliver Ames, and they wanted to give Oliver Ames a history lesson. This was nothing to be proud of. This was just a riot. You can't memorialize this. But according to them, Ames refused to listen. And in a later meeting, the same kind of people at the MHS, the Mass Historical Society, said, it looks like the governor is, quote, giving in to, quote, Negroes and cheap politicians. Instead of listening to educated people like themselves, they're actually listening to the people of Boston, which of course they didn't like one bit. The whole point was not to listen to them. You gotta listen to us. We know about history. And of course, there's a lesson there. Nobody keeps our history. Nobody preserves our history but us. We should all learn it. We should all be good custodians of our past. But you can't look to the people on Boylston Street to do it. They do a good job now. They do a great job now. We all love it now. But this is the 19th century. It's a little bit of a difference. And it's a good thing that they didn't succeed. And that's why we have the Boston Massacre Monument. Dr. Peabody gave a speech a little later on where he said, we simply could not overcome, quote, the influence of the colored people of Boston. Oh, well. But luckily, we have it. And next time you're on the Common, pay attention to that eagle. It's really, really good. I love the symbolism there. Eagle alighting on the statue. Freedom finding a home in Boston. A massacre of 1770. Adolf Krauss, unfortunately, died young, like Olin Warner did. He gave us the Theodore Parker statue, which is a great statue. Theodore Parker in Roxbury. That's his work. But after that, he slowly began to lose his capacities. He had this idea for a grand public monument depicting Balthasar from the writing on the wall story of the Old Testament. He devoted all his time to that. Nobody seemed to want it. He was very disappointed and died ailing, in grief. I think at the age of, he's in his early 50s when he finally died. But just as we have William Lloyd Garrison to remind us of Olin Warner, we have this to remind us of Adolph Krauss, as well as the greater values all of these monuments, I hope, represent. And that'll be all for now because we've reached the hour point.